I would like to thank my patrons supporting the channel and the creation of these videos. Let's continue this section to talk about padding. So most of the layout is handled by layout groups components. For example, the title here, title content, the layout, it has a horizontal layout group. So if we wanted to add more spacing in this box for the content of the text, we could start, for example, adding more padding here, like so, or to the top. And this is how you can play a little bit with the padding of this content box. So let's add here a 10. Now for the main content here, it's using a vertical layout group. So again, if you wanted to move the text a little bit, not near to the border of the box, you can play with the padding here as well. So let's say the left, and you can see you can play with it, so it's not near to the border. Okay. Similarly, the OK button and the cancel button, they had as well its own layout group, in this case horizontal, so you can play with the padding and having the content, the text of the buttons the way you want it. Next, about the scroll bar, if you want to change how it looks, we can just select the scroll bar view, the scroll bar vertical, and we can change either the background image here, or we could select here the handle component or game object and change the default UI sprite, which is really recommended because this is Unity's default UI sprite, so you might want to add your own image here and you can have better performance, I would say. So in order to play with the scroll bar itself, we need to click on the scroll bar vertical. Down below we have where is it? Actually, no, what we want to do is select the scroll bar game object itself, and we can move it. For example, if you wanted the scroll bar to be a little inward the UI box, so let's click here in the move tool and we could drag a little bit inward inside the main UI content, as well as we wanted to resize it. So let's shrink it a little bit, something like that. And of course, as I mentioned, to change the default images of this scroll bar. There are other type of components that we can add as optional components into our UI box. For example, we have the portraits, which are normally used to display the character image. What we need to do is select our main UI box, right click and go to Makinom UI box, and from here we have portrait, and we have three types of portrait to add. So what we can do, for example, is start by adding the empty portrait, and you can see it added this component to the side of our UI box. So be careful in case you are not selecting the proper game object and end up having nested UI boxes, which could lead to problems when rendering these components with ORK Framework. So after having this empty portrait, the use case of having empty portraits is to using prefabs, or to be filled with a custom prefab to portray animated sprite, for example. What I suggest to do here is now that we have this empty portrait, is we could go to our main UI box blue. Let's rename it UI box blue empty portrait, and then we can have the portrait was use our name. Okay, so I was planning to rename this game object, drag it to create a new prefab out of it, but it seems that it's not allowed anymore. So let's go back to the main scene and let's duplicate the UI box blue prefab here. So Ctrl D to duplicate it. Let's rename it portrait empty. Double click and now add our portrait. So UI Makinom UI box portrait empty. There we go. So it was already there. Okay, let me delete this one, and now we can save this prefab. Let's fix the original one and remove the portrait. There we go. As you may notice, I also had created another UI box, but in this case using flat images. So I will double click on it and also change the font I'm using here, just to have another sample of what we can do with styling the UI boxes. But let's continue with the portrait. So this component has a UI portrait. At some point you may have or may want to actually combine a sprite portrait or a texture portrait or your own prefab, and it's just a matter to add a sprite component here, an image component, and then reference that image here. So for example, if we were to add let's duplicate this one once again, and this case is going to be portrait sprite. So let's open up, let's remove the empty portrait and now select the UI box. Let's do the same, Makinom UI box portrait sprite. And so in this case, in this game object, we have again the UI portrait component, but now there is an image here. And in this case, what we are telling this special UI box with a portrait is to take the sprite that we had as a portrait in the framework editor. So for example, if we go to Ctrl Alt M to open the editor, and if we go to combatants, let's see the default combatant. If we go to the content information, this is the sprite here in this whatever we had here is going to be displayed as a sprite over here. On the other way around, there is also a texture. So let's do the same thing. Let's select the sprite in this case, why not? Let's duplicate it and let's change to portrait texture. What I'm trying to do here is just to build a database or of prefabs that we can export and then import on any ORK Framework Makinom project and avoid having to do this all over again from scratch. So let's open up this prefab. In this case, well, we have the image here, but we can remove this component and add a new component there, a raw image for a texture, for example. But let's do it from the contextual menu, which is faster, I guess. So portrait texture, there we go. So as you can see, it's using a raw image component in this case, and it's already referenced here in the UI portrait component. Okay, so let's say that we have three UI boxes with a portrait. So let's move on to the next one. And the next one is the page info. So we can add page information to show on which page, for multi-page text of course, is currently displayed. So in this case, let's not use the portrait one, but let's go back to the standard UI box blue we created earlier. And from here, always remember to click on the UI box or the root game object, right click, context, Makinom, UI box, then we select content, and then we have page info text mesh pro, and it will add this one of one. And you can see, well, I already changed the default text mesh pro to use the new font I was playing with, so it's okay. I'm happy with it. Also, we can do the same in the flat box, and I will deliver both to you as a Unity package later on. So what I forgot to do here, of course, is to duplicate the prefab to have a dedicated page info UI box. So let's do it again. I will delete this game object. Let's duplicate the UI box blue, and let's rename it to UI box blue page info. So let's open up and let's do the same process of creating this page info component. UI box, content, page info. There we go. Let's move on to the next one, which is the description content. So once again, I will duplicate the default UI box, and I will add the name description content. And you know the drill. Right click the UI box, Makinom, UI box, content, and description. So as you can see now, it added the description content below the UI box, but it's hiding the buttons. So what we can do here is just move this box a little bit lower, like so. And the purpose of this description component is to display the description content of any selected input, as described in the documentation. So after having our description created, we can save the prefab, and let's move on to the next one. Next in the list is the additional content. So additional content can be used to display different information in different parts of a UI box. This is available wherever content is displayed. For example, the main content or the title or individual buttons. A use case, for example, is when we have information displayed like the status name or the health plus the value. That's an additional content type of box or component. So we need to do the same thing. Let's duplicate once again this UI box blue and add additional content. Let's open up, and once again we need to click on the main UI box, right click, Makinom, UI box, content, additional content. So it will put it in the middle of the screen in this case, but unlike the other setup so far, the additional content is not automatically added to the UI box component setup. Depending on where we want this additional content to be available, the settings are found at different places. So for the main and the title content, this setting is in the UI box itself. So if we click on the UI box, we can see here that in the UI box component we have the content settings, we have the main content, and we can reference or add this additional content to either the main content or the title content. And we need to do so by clicking this button, add additional content, and we need to assign a unique content ID. I will just type content ID 001, and then we need to reference the component itself. So let's drag this additional content and put it here. So this is important to remember, this content ID we added here, because whatever uses this UI box to display information, it will need to use the same ID for this additional content. Next one in line is the tabs. So for that one we need to actually go back to our UI environment, because we need to create a custom or a brand new UI box with tabs. So these tabs are not something that we can add or easily add to an existing UI box. So let's create from the context menu, Makinom, UI box, tab, and here we can either create a UI box with the tabs on top or with the tabs at the bottom. So it depends on the design you have, but let's select the add tabs top for example. Okay, so what we have is the standard UI box, in this case using the standard images that we need to change later on, and we have now this tabs game object with an horizontal layout and the main text of the UI box content, of course. In the tabs game object is where all the buttons are going to be placed, in this case horizontal layout group, horizontally. So if we have, for example, an inventory with items, equipment, they will be put one beside the other. Alright. So similarly, if you wanted to build your prefab database, let's just rename this UI box to UI box, whatever color you change it. I will set it to blue again. Tabs top, and made a prefab out of it. Now I can delete it from the scene, and I will do the same in this case to create or to have a UI box, tab, tabs, add tabs at bottom. Okay, so we have the content and the tabs will be drawn at the bottom of whatever content we have here in this box. So let me just rename this one again, UI box, tabs bottom, and let's make a prefab out of it. UI box blue. Okay, so let's move on. If you want to see more, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. Thank you very much.